Hello everybody, Happy New Year. I've been working on this one, which is my take of the Classic, only with 24 frets. It's had, what has it had? Grain fill, and it's just had some clear coat, and it's had a 3-colour stain and then a sprayed burst. So I thought I'd show you what I did. So this is my take on the Classic, which is kind of a mishmash between Gibson PRS, and it's got a Patrick Eggle style neck heel, 625mm scale, which is a new one for me, and we're going for P90, and then a humbucker that'll have a push-pull wraparound bridge that's going on there. What else we got? Mahogany body and neck, maple binding, or natural binding rather. So it's 8-9mm maple top, and then ebony fretboard. So the first thing I did was to wipe the whole surface down with water and really work that in with a rag, and that just raised the grain, and that helps alcohol-based dyes soak in slightly better than they would otherwise do. And then I went over it with quite a heavy coat of Angelus purple dye, and once I'd worked that in, I then came back and used some of the Angelus neutral just to help blend that and then pull out some of that excess colour. Once that had completely dried, I then used my orbital sander and I sanded it back with 220 grit to almost nothing in places. You can see like these areas here where the stain came out completely. There's very little figure in this area. In fact, this is much harder grain in the wood here, which is why the dye didn't soak in as far, and that's why the dye almost completely came out once I sanded it. Once I'd completely sanded back the purple, I wet the surface again and went over it with a rag just to open up those wood fibres again. And then I went over it with yellow dye, this time a water-based dye, crimson yellow, from their Stunning Stains range. And all over YouTube people tell you that water-based and alcohol-based dyes don't mix, but as you can see they do. Purple plus yellow equals brown, and some of this more heavy figuring has turned almost completely brown. There is still a hint of purple there, but it is mostly brown. Once I'd gone over it with the yellow and let that dry thoroughly for a couple of hours, I then used Angelus rose, light rose leather dye, and that mixed with the yellow, and that has brought out the orange. It did also mix with the purple and brought out some of the purple again. However, that does start to disappear slightly later on. So once I finished colouring it, I then rolled over all these edges to give it that natural binding look. So to do the natural binding then, I tend to sand the edges. I find sanding tends to work better than scraping, and I used 120 grit sandpaper, and I just kind of go around the edge and sand in a noticeable facet with just really bevel that edge over, and then I just soften that with 220 and then 320 grit. So to seal it, I use cellulose sanding sealer from Chestnut Finishes. I tend to find that sanding sealer can pull out just a hint of the last colour you've put on. So in this case what it's done is it's just pulled out a little bit of the light rose colour, reintroduced some of those yellows, but it's also dulled down a lot of the purple that was reintroduced by the rose. So in this case it works quite well. I think a lot of different finishes have their own quirks, and you just kind of have to learn their quirks and make them work for you. In this case I wanted a sort of orangey coloured guitar. I didn't want a pinky purple guitar. So had I have used like a water-based or a 2K or something, then that would have probably kept it looking much more pinky than it has. Whereas anything with cellulose in tends to just add a little bit of yellowing. So once it was sealed, I gave the whole thing one coat of clear lacquer, and that was really just so there's something for the lacquer to stick to when I spray the burst. So once I had some clear on it and that clear was dried, I then taped off the edge of the binding using thin painter's tape from StewMac, and it's quite awkward to get this tape round, to be honest. So I placed the tape so it was almost touching the very edge of the stain, but not quite. It's just a tiny little lip, like a fraction of a millimetre all the way round of the unstained maple. And the reason for that is it's better to have a little bit of raw maple that's had some tinted spray on it rather than have some tape over the stain, because when you pull the tape you'll end up finding exposed orange and not the natural maple, whereas the natural maple can just be sanded or scraped back. So yeah, it's incredibly tedious doing the taping. I then also had to tape the rest of the sides as well to prevent any overspray getting on those. And once that was taped up, I then got to spraying a burst. So for the burst, I had some brown lacquer already mixed up, which I'd used last week to spray the burst on Duncan's SG. But that guitar is green, quite a dark green, so I just needed to darken the lacquer up ever so slightly, just really because this guitar is so much lighter, and I just added a little bit of black Angelus dye just to darken it up a bit, and then I sprayed the burst. And the way I spray a burst is quite time consuming, and that's because I set my gun, so it's quite a fine paint pattern, and it's also very little paint that's coming out of the gun. And the idea of that is that I can just very gradually creep up on the colour I want. I think for the first minute of me spraying this burst you almost can't see anything on the camera, and eventually those coats just gradually start to build up to produce the burst that I'm looking for. And it is just a subtle burst I was after, really just to even up and darken up the very edge, but not to hide any of that figure, because most of the nice figure on this top is all around the edge. So I just wanted it to darken up as it gets to the edge, and then you can see the figure disappearing off down into the binding. Now I need to scrape all around this edge, but I'm going to put some clear on first, because if I do it now, this paint is very delicate, and if I chip it at all, which I could very easily, then I'll end up having to do it again. So a couple of coats of clear, then we scrape. So once I had that final coat of lacquer on, I just then needed to sand these very edges, just where you could see a little bit of spillover, either where the brown had got in underneath the tape, which can happen in a couple of spots if it's not burnished down properly, or just where I hadn't quite taped up to the stain, just to tidy it up. First guitar, 2022. So now that this one has had final coat of clear over the burst, it just needs, I would say, 3 or 4 more coats of clear on it, and then it'll be a case of level sanding, buffing, and then putting it together. If anybody's interested in seeing the finished article, then I normally post them up on Facebook or Instagram, maybe a demo, and if anybody's interested, this one will probably be up on my website for sale in a few weeks. Cheers, see you next time.